International Edition's Steve Miller gets reaction on the arrests in a conversation with Dean Cheng, Senior Research Fellow for Chinese Political and Security Affairs at the Heritage Foundation.
Frankly, a lot of it I've been wondering sort of what the Chinese have been thinking about Hong Kong in the midst of COVID-19. My impression is that the protests have died down, not surprising given that nobody wants to spread it. But given this lull, would Beijing make the best of it and do very little to try and keep things tamped down, or would they instead take advantage of this as an opportunity? And clearly they've decided to go with the latter.
Now, if we take a look at what at least the Hong Kong government is putting out about the arrest, they were essentially these individuals being arrested for illegal assembly. And during last year, during the time of the pro-democracy protests, a lot of the assemblies and protests were in fact not given permission to do so. So if you take a look at what the Hong Kong government is saying is their rationale for arresting these individuals, what do you take in terms of that information as opposed to Beijing's, statements earlier and later last year opposing the pro-democracy movement?
So when we look at how the Chinese write about legal warfare, it is the use of the law, writ broadly. So laws, regulations, treaties, international law, domestic law, in order to achieve previously determined political ends. And they emphasize it isn't really a matter of legality as we understand it. Go to a impartial court and adjudicate things. It is the use of legal instruments to achieve what you wanted to achieve anyway. It's to basically, as they themselves say, what we do is right, what you do is wrong, and if what we do has to be wrong, it's because you've created a situation like that. So I look at, were these protests conducted without permits? Quite possibly. I have to admit, I have not gone and looked at the specifics of these cases. Is arresting these activists the right answer? Is this typical, or in other cases of quote-unquote illegal assembly, do people get summonses, do they get fines, et cetera? And that's before we look at this in the context of Chinese statements just this past week, for example, where the liaison office and the Office for Hong Kong and Macau Affairs said, we report directly to Beijing and our authority trumps anything in Hong Kong.
So if we take a look at the timing, you were mentioning that you were wondering what Beijing was thinking, what, if anything, would happen to this, as the curve seems to have flattened in many parts of Asia. Is this perhaps, in your opinion, a way for Beijing to kind of quell any kind of return to the protests ahead of any kind of stay-at-home orders and lockdown procedures being lifted?
I don't think that it's in the context of Asia, because I don't think that the Chinese are necessarily worried about a reaction in Seoul or in Tokyo or even Taipei. I think that they are watching the fairly confused, rather chaotic responses across the West, in Europe, in the United States, and taking advantage of that aspect to basically sweep up all of these activists under a veneer of illegality. Hey, they violated these rules. They didn't have permits. We're arresting them, and we have every legal right to do so. But doing that exactly before we're likely to have all of the pieces in place to provide some kind of coherent response.
I guess kind of my question really was more along the lines of, hey, the curve seems to be flattening in China and Hong Kong, and pro-democracy movement has been lingering since the umbrella movements several years ago. And as restrictions in Hong Kong may be relaxed in the future, is this a preemptive attempt by the government or Beijing to kind of arrest the leaders or detain the leaders in such a way to quell any kind of future protests before they get a chance to bring them up again?
Yes, I do think that if and when Hong Kong lifts its own lockdown procedures, it is quite possible that we would see a return to protests. So yes, I do think that Beijing is also thinking of cutting that off at the knees or nipping it in the bud. So yes, that is a factor in the timing with regards to Hong Kong's situation.